Hello, everyone. I'm Kibin Alleyne, and today is Tuesday, September 12th. You are now watching Open, a program that brings the Bronx and New York City straight to you. Don't forget to stay connected with us via social media at BronxNet TV. Many Americans find it difficult to save and budget their finances. To assist with making smarter financial decisions, financial experts suggest following the 50-30-20 rule. This involves categorizing expenses into three groups and adjusting your spending and saving behaviors accordingly. Senior Industry Analyst at Bankrate, Ted Rossman, joins me to discuss this money-saving method. Ted, thank you so much for joining me.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Now, can you just give us an overview of the 50-30-20 rule and pretty much explain what that is?
Sure. The 50-30-20 rule basically refers to this idea that you should spend 50% of your income on necessities, 30% on wants, and 20% goes towards savings. Now, this is a framework, of course. Everybody's budget's going to be a little bit different, but that's the main idea.
Now, how does this actually help in managing your personal finances?
I think it's a good rule of thumb to ensure that you're not overspending in some categories, because really the essence of personal finance is living on less than you make and hopefully setting money aside for a rainy day and setting money aside for retirement and other future goals. All that said, and I think some viewers are probably thinking this right now, this may be easier said than done. And for example, there's data out there that about a third of New York City residents are spending 50% or more of their income just on rent. So I just wanted to address that sort of at the top here, that if you're feeling a little uneasy or overwhelmed by this, it's a guideline. I mean, yes, we would like to adhere to this or something similar, but it's tough. I mean, life is expensive. Inflation has squeezed people. You can imagine if you're spending half of your income on rent and you're supposed to be spending half on all necessities, what happens with food and medical care and transportation and other things? This is actually one of the things that's really leading to increased credit card debt right now, because a lot of people are having to finance essentials that they may not have the cash flow or the savings.
Now, I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think whenever we're talking about money and saving, it's always great to kind of look at every aspect, because as you mentioned, not everybody may be able to do this, especially if you have very low income or maybe you have very high needs. Why? Can you just explain a little bit further why this may not work for everybody, and how can somebody figure out if this is actually the right method for them?
Especially with housing costs super high right now, and really the cost of everything. I mean, you think about groceries, you think about insurance, gas, all these essentials, not to mention all the discretionary stuff too. I mean, people have a lot of demand for travel and dining and other experiences like concerts and sporting events. And I think another way to look at this is maybe let's start with the 20. So that's supposed to be the savings bucket. I think it does work really well to pay yourself first, because I think a lot of what we're hitting on here is that life is expensive. If you try to save what's left over at the end of the month, there may not be anything left over. So maybe work backwards. Think about carving out that 20% savings first. And honestly, maybe it's not 20% for everybody. Maybe you start with 5 or 10 and you try to gradually bump it up. We're talking about everything from retirement savings, like a 401k, workplace retirement plan, to your emergency savings fund. And maybe consider automating both. A lot of people have these biweekly contributions to a retirement plan and it just gets taken out of your paycheck. Maybe do the same thing with savings and carve out a separate direct deposit that goes into a savings account. Some savings accounts are yielding about 5% right now. So I think that's another way to sort of think about this process, is save first and then spend later on.
Now, how does the 50-30-20 rule maybe align or differ from some other budgeting practices that we may have heard of?
Honestly, a lot of people don't even have a budget. So I think we should start there. I think this is really important. Sit down with your spouse if you have one. Try to map it out. It's not going to be exact. It's not going to be the same every month, but some things will be. I mean, I would say start with the big stuff: housing, transportation, medical insurance, food, things like that, and then kind of go on from there. Some people like this envelope method where you maybe even literally put cash in certain envelopes for certain types of spending. And maybe you've got your grocery envelope, you've got your restaurant envelope, and other things. And the idea is that when it's out, it's out. And you can't just put it on the credit card and finance it at 20% interest. Maybe you could borrow from another envelope. That would be better than borrowing from the bank. Maybe you say that, all right, we're going to eat out less this month because we spent more on other things. Some people talk about this zero-based budgeting approach where you basically give every dollar a job and basically assign from the get-go. Some of this is a little easier said than done, but I think the basic premise is the same. You need to track your spending. So keep a spending journal, or if you're using a credit card or debit card, comb through those statements, figure out what you're spending, and account for the periodic expenses as well. Like if that car insurance renews every 6 months, you don't want that to catch you by surprise.
Now, we're talking about like how it's easier said than done. What if you are starting out in an area where maybe you can't do this? When do you start to say like, okay, I think things are becoming a little bit more stable for me now. Maybe I can try this. When do you encourage people to start looking into this once they are out of a situation that's pretty challenging?
I think it's great to have a budget at any stage. Maybe some of the specific parameters will change. I like this gradual escalation idea. Sometimes a 401k will even do this automatically, where like right now, maybe you can only afford to contribute 5%, but maybe next year that bumps up to 6%. You can do this on your own too. Maybe the next time you get a raise, you bump it up, or maybe you make a note in your calendar that in a year, maybe better yet, 6 months or even 3 months, you go up. The idea, I think, is that slow and steady can win the race sometimes. And a lot of this comes back to long-term pursuits. But, if you set money aside from the get-go, you're less likely to miss what you don't see. So carve it right off the top, have that money go right into investments or savings if you can, and then gradually look to step it up over time. It might be hard to go from saving nothing to saving 20%, but if you go from, let's say, 5 to 7 to 10, over the course of 6 months or a year, maybe that feels more sustainable.
Now, I also want to talk about the fact that this seems pretty flexible. You even mentioned earlier that it doesn't have to be 50, 30, 20. You can do things that are a little bit more comfortable or something that's more doable for you. Why is that so important, especially when we're talking about finances and money?
The average credit card rate right now is a record high 20.65%. And I think that's an important aspect of this because if you don't have savings, no shame, a lot of people just aren't able to save. But if you don't have savings and an emergency expense comes up, like a medical bill, a home repair, car repair, and you can't afford it, well, then it lands on the credit card and then you can get trapped in this expensive debt cycle. So that's, I think, one of the biggest justifications for setting aside this rainy day money. It's a journey, not something that's going to happen overnight. But I think that's also proof that it's working. So if you have this savings, and even if it gets wiped out in a few months by an unexpected bill, well, at least you had it. And then you can start over. So you're not loading up the credit card. What becomes really systemic is minimum credit card payments. If you make minimum payments towards the average balance, which is about $6,000, the average rate, you'll be in debt for about 18 years. And you're going to pay way more in interest than you did in the first place. Your total interest bill would be about $8,500 on top of the $6,000 you charged in the first place. So I use that as a cautionary tale to say that, yes, it may be easier said than done, but every little bit you can save helps future you, but it also helps you ward off this expensive credit card debt.
Now, we talked about how sometimes it's hard for people to create a budget, and I can imagine sometimes it's a little bit discouraging if you don't feel like you have a good foundation. But what are some tips or steps that you think individuals can take so that they can create a budget and, as you mentioned, kind of gradually grow in this area?
Some people keep it really simple and old-fashioned where they write it out on paper or they stuff money into envelopes. You could use a very simple spreadsheet. There's actually a lot of apps out there. There's one that's very popular among young adults called You Need a Budget. And there are apps, there are websites that can help you with this. I think the biggest framework is you need to know where you've been in order to know where you're going. So I don't think enough people are having these conversations. I think it's important to sit down with your spouse. Maybe the first time you do it, you set a timer because people don't want to get bored with talking about money forever and ever. But maybe you set a 15-minute timer, you do it over a glass of wine or something like that. I think over time we can get even more intentional about these kind of money conversations, but figure out what you've spent recently, what you need to spend this month, and over time start to think about those future goals too, because I think that's really what gets people pulling in the same direction about, all right, we're not just budgeting to deprive ourselves from something, but we're budgeting because we want to do something in the future, whether that's having a kid or buying a home or saving more for retirement or taking a great vacation. Try to think about a budget as a tool that helps you get what you want, not just something that's denying you in the near term.
And I also think it's so important to mention that when you do this, you actually learn how much money you're spending on things, because when you just do it naturally, you don't notice like, wow, I spent $100 on like takeout this week. And so I think it could only help, people in the long run. And although it can seem intimidating, I think that it's a worthwhile effort to take, when saving money. Now, can you just talk about just the benefits overall of being properly informed and choosing the right budget plan? Because 50-30-20 may not work for everybody, but what can they do to make sure they're choosing the right thing?
Yeah, I like that example that you just gave about tracking your spending can help you realize, do you have money leaks? Are you spending too much on takeout? Could you benefit from cooking at home more, or bringing lunch to work, or making your own coffee? I think sometimes people kind of scoff at these ideas that, like, if you skip the $5 coffee every day, you're going to become a millionaire in the future. It maybe isn't quite that simple, but I do think that there is some truth to this money leaks phenomenon. Or maybe it's too many Uber rides. Could you take the subway instead? At least some of the time. I think there's moderation to a lot of things, but I think that's really another foundation to a good budget, is kind of figuring out what you value, what you can afford to spend. It's going to be different for different people, but prioritize those key spending categories. Obviously the essentials, but even within that discretionary piece, are there some things that you're just spending kind of mindlessly on, or are there things that you truly value? Do you have overlapping subscriptions? Could you cut back on some of those extra happy hours or expensive cab rides when you could do something cheaper?
Well, Ted, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this really informative conversation.
Thank you for having me.
To learn more about the 50-30-20 rule, please go to the website on your screen below. Don't go away. We'll be back with more Open right after this.